Bom dia, good morning from Portugal. The morning after the big power outage that was all over the news for Portugal and Spain. And I just wanted to offer a few reflections just as an individual living here in a small town, as you can see, in a country rural area of Portugal, in a little town nearby. Just currently out walking with my dogs. And just some observations from yesterday that were quite interesting, I would like to think. I'm just going to go quiet for 1 minute and point out the wind turbines behind me, which only a few are operating. There's not a great deal of wind this morning, but there is one going slowly. I'll just see if you can hear it. No, I don't think you'll pick it up on this mic, but there's only one operating. So there's a little bit of noise right now. So enjoy the countryside as we walk down. Yesterday the power was out without notice. So just some observations. First of all, that nobody seemed to have any idea what was going on. Now I understand we don't understand the causes or whatever, but there was no updates on anything anywhere that I could find. I was in the car around the time that the power systems went down, and the radio station that I was listening to was just playing continual music. So they didn't provide any news updates. They normally have half-hourly, hourly news. They didn't provide anything at all. And they obviously potentially were working on assisted power of some sort, and just put the radios in as the music in, as an autopilot. I understand that. But I did think that there would be some announcements come over the radio issued by the government to say, this is what's happening. We didn't know, we got mixed reports of whether it was just Portugal. I heard fairly quickly it was definitely Portugal and Spain, and then some parts of France. We did hear that it was other parts of Europe or all of Europe. We simply didn't know, and nor did any of the other locals that I spoke to. So there seemed to be no news updates anywhere that I could find, and I was a bit surprised at that. I'm from a country that does have emergency flooding and potentially cyclones and things like that, and fires, and we still get updates. At the end of the day, I did see someone else online this morning say that they got a text message from the government saying they were expected to resume power within the next few hours. I didn't get anything. I didn't get any updates whatsoever. But in general in life, a couple of the things that I noticed straight away was that everything was lovely and quiet. Of course, I'm talking from someone who was not seriously inconvenienced or affected in any way. I live a pretty simple life. I knew that I had access down on my land, which is where I'm walking now, to solar, off-grid solar, and a power bank if I needed it. So I wasn't stressed in any way. As I say, I'm from a country that Australia, who often has emergencies, so I always have a little excess water and food for a few days just as an emergency backup. So I wasn't stressed. I knew I had food there. I knew what to do if the electricity went off in terms of keeping the fridge closed and just taking out what you need and things like that. And I had a gas bottle. But some of the observations I noticed, I went and spoke to all my neighbours to let them know that I knew it wasn't just our town, which many people thought initially, and it was actually all of Portugal and potentially Spain or Europe as well. And people just had no preparation at all. They didn't have spare water, nothing. The local supermarket closed almost immediately, although the larger ones in the local town 15 kilometres away were open. But the cafes and things like that remained open. But people didn't have a lot of anything to survive more than a day or two on essential items, which is interesting, and I hope this reminds them to resolve that. The big thing that I think is an irony is that I went to speak to one of my neighbours who has a solar system, and he said, I don't understand why the solar's not working. I have a solar system. And it's because here in Portugal, I don't know the laws, so don't come at me about the laws and regulations, but certainly you get financial incentives if you have solar, if you connect to the grid. But that is not offered if you do it off-grid. And I spoke to, as I was looking at an off-grid system myself, and I know it was substantially more expensive to go off-grid, even without the government incentive package. So what they're incentivizing is certainly people to have solar, but it must go via the grid. And of course, when the grid went down, the neighbours with solar were really surprised to find that they didn't have power. They thought they were going to be just fine, and they didn't realise that. And I think that's a big flaw in the system. If we're going to have decentralised renewable power, we need to, yes, sure, we can have a system that feeds into the grid to help the grid, but surely there can be an off switch or a flick over switch into an off-grid scenario if we want to keep the power for ourselves solely. It's a crazy system. The other thing is the wind turbines, and I'm actually suspecting something may have happened to them altogether. But yesterday, none of the wind turbines were operating. So these wind turbines, I have something like 18 of them next to my home. One of the first things I noticed was how quiet my town was. Now, I'm in a little town. It is quiet. It's a little country town, and it's really quiet and really peaceful. But what we have overhanging us is this whirring. It sounds like a big truck coming down the highway at a distance, and you can hear it coming, of the wind turbines, especially when it's windy. And yesterday wasn't an excessively windy day, but it was more windy than today. And all the wind turbines were just stopped. And it was really kind of eerie. It was actually the thing that made me feel very eerie, was that this complete silence and stillness from the wind turbines. And what a fatal flaw in the ridiculousness of that system is that the electricity must operate to keep those going. Now, I don't know the technical stuff behind this, so maybe someone in the comments can tell me why. I've heard that potentially it's to get the blades started, but then the wind would continue, and there was plenty of wind for them to continue yesterday. Someone else said that it needed to be a continuous supply, and because it would stop-start erratically, they couldn't keep the electricity coming from them at a continuous rate feeding into wherever they were feeding. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because wind stops and starts, they change how much they move all of the time. And it would feed, I would imagine, into a battery system, power battery system, not into individual homes that would create a surge. So you would think that they would still be operating, even if it didn't bring electricity to the people, to the towns and to the people. You would think they would still be operating and stocking up the batteries of the grid, the power system of the grid, ready for use, because there's obviously, when the electricity comes on, everybody's going to race in and everything's going to be under a surge. All the refrigeration's going to return back on. Everything's going to come on. So there's going to be a big use of electricity usage. And, the electricity outage was only for, 10 hours or so. So you can imagine after days, there would be no electricity going into the grid to keep it well stocked. People would be using it a lot after that time, if necessary, and to restart everything after 2 or 3 days, if it had gone for 2 or 3 days. And these wind turbines were not working. So what a fatal flaw amongst, in my opinion, many in the setup of these wind turbine systems, that apparently, for whatever reason, you need the grid, the non-renewable grid, to work the renewable system. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me, and I'm happy to hear what people can offer me on that one. So the two sets of renewables that people have available to them in times of emergency were not available to people, the solar or the wind turbines. For me, I do have a camping kit just a camping kit, so it wouldn't have lasted me for serious things. I certainly couldn't have kept my fridge operating or anything like that, but I could keep charging my phone and computer, those sorts of things. Also, because of camping, I have a gas bottle, so I was able to bring my gas bottle back and my gas stove and cook dinner last night, whereas many people didn't have that. And I know that in some countries of the world, they're talking about telling people they must cut off the gas in their homes and not use gas. They must only use electricity. And of course, what's going to happen if that's the case? If people are only have to disconnect their gas stoves required to use electricity, and then the electricity is not available. It's food for thought. I hope that this encourages people to stop and question some of these policies more than they already are. In addition to that, just some general observations. Portugal being Portugal in a small town, certainly I don't want to downgrade the inconvenience to people who may have been stuck in some very difficult situations, especially in the city of Lisbon, where there were no lights. People were stuck in elevators, hospitals, only went back to emergency situations. Dreadful, I'm sure. So I don't want to downplay that. But for me, in the small town, the cafes were still open. People actually, jokingly but not jokingly, were saying they were going down to the cafe even more than they always do, which is daily anyway. Because they weren't working and this was a fun opportunity to go down to the local cafe, but also because they wanted people were eating ice cream because they knew that the shop owner was getting their stock destroyed. And so I specifically heard in one local shop, I walked in and thought, I'll just grab some eggs because I knew I could cook them easily, and I didn't expect it to be a long, long time, as in days. But I heard people specifically buying something like cheese because they knew that they could consume that. I'm assuming they knew that they could consume that in the day or so. If they've got a family, you can get through a block of cheese that day. But they said, we'll buy this because you're not going to be able to resell it later. And I thought that was amazing. People actually trying to buy some of the perishable items from the stores, knowing that this was going to cause a big loss to the shop owners who didn't have refrigeration, and many of them didn't have generators and refrigeration. So we were sitting down. For me, I was still working out on my land, so my day wasn't particularly affected. But I went down at the end of the day to try and find out what was going on. There was no news, and I didn't know whether anybody had heard something. I hoped that a Portuguese person would know more than I did, so I walked down into the cafe, and everybody was sitting around drinking still chilled beer, although not as cold, and having a few drinks and chatting and laughing. And it was wonderful. The cafes were lit by the remaining sunlight until it went down, and then there was no televisions running. Normally they have the big screen televisions that are always going in the background when you go to the cafes, and I think it's such a shame. I don't like it at all. So there was no cafes, there was no noise, there was no radios. There was people just chatting and laughing and talking about what was happening and what their experiences were. And man, I miss that. I don't know about the rest of you who are a little bit older, where we just did that in life generally. And I know there was people there that were feeling a little stressed about when they'd be able to access the internet. I was a little stressed because I couldn't get hold of my son. The telephone lines were down, and he had a message saying he was thinking he was going to leave the local city of Lisbon and drive to me, and then that was the last I heard, and he didn't show up. And so I didn't know whether he was broken down, had some issue getting out of the city because there was no traffic lights, whether he wasn't allowed to leave the city, or whether he simply had changed his mind and felt it would be better to stay, which is, as it turned out, I found out in the middle of the night that is what had happened. And of course, he had no way of communicating that to me. There was no telephone lines, and there was no internet. In fact, the telephone lines came on quite a lot after the internet did. which was interesting. So yeah, an interesting experience, and one I think shows a number of things. And I think that we really need to look at the way things are structured for our renewable systems, if that's what they wish to bring in, to make them functional in a non-renewable environment, because otherwise it's just a ridiculous concept. And there are many issues around that, the renewableness of wind turbines for starters, potentially for solar system and lithium, etc. as well. But to see this laid out in the moment was really telling for me. And that people are really unprepared, even for a day of being off-grid. And I hope that's a wake-up call for people to make sure that they are available. It's not about prepping. It's about being prepared for an emergency and normal life circumstances, to at least have a few days worth of things available to you at all times. And thirdly and lastly, I think the big takeaway from me was how quiet and peaceful it was. People were laughing, people were smiling. Again, I'm sure there was some stressful situations for people, but for those who were less affected in the moment, what I saw was a really lovely community spirit come in, and a little concern of what's caused this, what is going on, what is truly happening. And I still have no idea. I haven't seen anything on it yet, but I haven't been on a computer this morning either. But just a really lovely atmosphere of community spirit and chit chat and calm, and I miss it. I miss it from our lifetimes of just being connected with our community and not having to have the internet to connect us all of the time, everywhere. It's just crazy. Anyway, so this is the beautiful Portuguese countryside. I've just brought my puppies out for a walk, and I hope that's of interest to people who were living. I'm sure there'll be many different perspectives today about what actually happened yesterday, and I'm sure we'll hear many stories of the reasons why. Have a great day. Bye.